Yours was the kiss that awoke my heart. There lingers still, though we're far apart, the taste of honey, tasting much sweeter than wine. Do-do-do-do. Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion.
And in my humble opinion, Ethan Coen and Trisha Cook are two of the biggest freaks to ever make movies!
Well, GURRDIE, I suppose it was only a matter of time before you decided to chime in again.
You mean it was only a matter of time before you ended up watching a movie where you were utterly ill-prepared to convey just how terrible it was?
Oh, come now, GURRDIE. Honey, don't. It's not terrible.
You tourists make me sick! And for what it's worth, coming from the guy who actually liked Drive-Away Dolls, I'm not sure that I should have much confidence in your over-backward-bending apologia for every time one of your esteemed veteran filmmakers phones in a rehash of his already done-to-death style of quirkingly sadistic, non-sequitur-laden black comic crime capers. So let's just take a breath here and acknowledge. Yes. Ethan Coen has an immense pedigree coming from his previous collaborations with his brother, writing, directing, editing, and producing partner Joel Coen, spanning the independent film renaissance and up through closing on 4 decades of, generally speaking, quite exceptional films traversing genres and period settings and alternately moody and baldly strange and comedic tones expressed through the remarkable flexibility of style. But the fact is that for the time being, the Coens have split up, and their new debut careers as independent filmmakers, now independent from each other, are taking them down some wildly different paths. You might as well see Drive-Away Dolls as the emergence of a new collaborating voice in Ethan Coen and his wife and creative partner Trisha Cook. And you know what it feels like? It feels like a dim imitation of a Coen Brothers joint, one that needs to wear a B-movie costume to mask how creakingly B in scope and inspiration it actually is, before it even gets to be an homage to that kind of thing. And with Honey Don't, this new united creative powerhouse in indie cinema gets its sophomore follow-up, its spiritual and thematic successor, and sister, Ethan Coen and Trisha Cook are some f***ing freaks, and not the sexy kind, which is to say, not like yours truly.
Submitted for your approval, GURRDIE the Daemonosaur.
Sucks! This movie sucks, 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 sucks. Sucks, sucks, sucks. Sucks, sucks, sucks. New movie rant. New movie rant. Hello everyone, my name is GURRDIE the Daemonosaur. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Rant! And I'm ever so terribly excited to talk to you about this garbage I had to see because of the jerk-off down there who was thinking he was gonna be transported back to the cinematic wonderland of hot action. I mean, in the words of Olivia Colman's PC Doris Thatcher in Hot Fuzz, nothing like a little girl on girl. But don't worry, folks, he suffered through a truly bad movie as punishment for his purgatorial sins of thought, although I don't know how he expects to repay me, an innocent victim, of a movie from which I would have gladly spared myself and others if given the time to warn them that while Drive-Away Dolls was merely unremarkably boring, Honey Don't is more or less remarkably boring as well as being at times rather deranged. Coen and Cook have cooked up, I guess, this companion piece, part of this ostensive trilogy with Drive-Away Dolls as its first entry of throwback B-movie sort of black comedies where Margaret Qualley returns to the starring role, portraying another rather hard-bitten southern lesbian cast-off as she did in Drive-Away Dolls, this time a private investigator named Honey O'Donohue in Bakersfield, California, who finds out one day that one of her clients has died in a horrific car wreck. But But Honey Don't isn't a mystery yarn. It's a crime movie, which means that the game is given away pretty much from the get-go. The movie opens with an honestly quite erotically charged sequence of actress Lyra Abava as some mysterious waif whose matching strapless leopard bikini top and hair scarf who cuts an image obliquely inspired by the sexploitation grindhouse flicks of the mid-60s. She steps down into the ravine where the car of, we learn later, Honey's client has crashed and flipped over. She takes a mysterious ring off her finger, and then this mysterious woman gets back on her motorcycle. Then she takes a detour to go nude bathing, with both the bathing and the redressing being shot with a protracted, immaculate sense of glowing, colorful sensuality and, frankly, just naked voyeurism. Now, to skip ahead, this ring turns out to connect Honey's client to a local sex cult run by Chris Evans. It turns out the death was staged in order to prevent Honey's client from potentially divulging the fact that even Chris Evans' sex cult is just a front for a drug trafficking racket. They get into some of their own ultimately non sequitur escapades of killing and aestheticized violence, and if it sounds like I'm feeling a little tedious describing this aspect of Honey Don't, it's because it is tedious. It's not more tedious than Honey's own investigation turns out to be, though the style and tone of Honey Don't is a little more Big Lebowski, much like with Fargo and No Country for Old Men. It's basically done in this style that at once reveals so much from parallel narratives originating from and then converging on the same event, both the side of the criminals and the side of the person investigating them, but it's also cryptic at turns, relying not just on unstated associations, things we're supposed to be following and picking up on without having any character come out and do some shoehorned exposition or commentary. There's also more than a few occasions of just straight up deus ex machina, which is also incredibly tedious. Honey Don't isn't just a kind of strange contemporary set throwback to B-movies and pulp literature. It's frequently absurdist, even at its most gruesomely violent, which is where that homage that Cohen and Cook engage in ends up straddling both cheesy sexploitation and paperback lesbian erotica, and kinda like if Herschel Gordon Lewis actually cared if his splatter films had passable cinematography. But the fact is that even as Honey's detours eventually take her to an unlikely femme fatale in the form of Aubrey Plaza as a gruff, frustrated cop who starts hooking up with her, there is not a single moment in Honey Don't that is as electric as literally just the first few minutes of Lyra Abava appearing on screen, stealing the ring from the crash, and then going skinny dipping. The heart of Honey Don't is purely in this unapologetically sexy worshipping of Lyra Abava as not a sexualized object, but as an erotic subject. Her nudity as dress, the deliberate attention that Cohen and Cook call to it, Cohen as director and Cook as editor. This isn't a movie that's trying to make us uncomfortable by turning us on. Quite frankly, it's a glorious ice pick in the eye of a mainstream film culture in which movies aimed exclusively at adults are marginalized, and the ones that embrace the potential at all for adult-oriented cinematic art frequently neglect sex and the erotic entirely. That's what Honey Don't does. It embraces that cinematic art of erotic pleasure. Or at least those first few minutes do. Honey Don't spends the rest of its 90-minute runtime, which, with how much both parallel narratives of the sex cult drug traffickers and Honey's sapphic escapades end up dragging under the weight of so much derivativeness, not just in terms of Cohen's previous and especially his much earlier works with his brother Joel, but in terms of all the similar kind of absurdist crime flicks that they inspired. This movie feels way longer than 90 minutes, and I'm still waiting for one of these throwback pseudo-exploitation art flicks to see if they can tell a story in between 60 and 80 minutes. Honey Don't spends the rest of its runtime basically running away from that charge, dressing it up in so much frippery that one begins to suspect, God damn it, We have been dragged hook, line, and sinker into a tiresomely Puritan movie that is as lazily affected in its sex appeal as it is in its dialogue. Cook's influence as co-writer not seeming to break off much in what feels like Cohen chewing over the gristle left from the steak of so many of his own collabs with his brother, which he's cannibalizing as much here as he and Joel cannibalized their own influences to create what was once an original and vibrant pastiche, but now just smacks of humorlessness rooted in hack work. People might be shocked to hear about an ultra-violent lesbian crime black comedy being framed as Puritan, but trust me, even when Cohen and Cook are following the spaghetti entrails of their story to, say, Honey beating the crap out of her niece's abusive boyfriend, complete with taking his gun, smashing it, and plastering a feminist bumper sticker over the MAGA logo on his car, the overt agitprop sensibilities of Honey Don't, which become increasingly a foreground, almost polemical matter in the film, akin not so much to old exploitation films, but indeed to how Spike Lee might write a picture, might be progressive in the most pedantic sense. But the overall feeling that Honey Don't inspires, through its sense of its being a pale imitation of a done-to-death pastiche, with its progressively, aggressively boring visual language, a cinematographer like Ari Wegner of all people, whose eye has given us such sumptuous masterpieces of the pleasure of looking in film, from Peter Strickland's In Fabric, to Justin Kurzel's True History of the Kelly Gang, to Janiska Bravo's At Zola, to Jane Champion's The Power of the Dog. The cinematography, the look of Honey Don't, its ways of looking are so pedestrian that it feels practically like a sabotage, like even the most antiseptic pleasure of looking in a film has been denuded and made mechanical, Cohen at least cycling through tropes of his own career and producing a stagey, wooden version of it. Honey Don't is so elementally boring, right down to just how Cohen chooses to direct his camera, that even as an ultra-violent lesbian crime black comedy or whatever, it feels repressed. It feels almost mortified with itself. It feels like after those few seconds of seeing Lyra Ababa get to be some inspiringly bizarre cross-section of Tura Satana, Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, and a living Excalibur from the bosom of the water in the kitschiest lady form, the movie itself retreats from its own sensualism, and as it drags on, Honey Don't feels more and more like a movie that is afraid of sexual pleasure more than anything else. Maybe Cohen as a director is just too out of his depth as a solo jockey, but when I really try to think about every belabored minute of Honey Don't, I can only reckon with the fact that while the film's sense of humor is fairly game when it comes to making a gag or two out of violence and death, sex in this movie can be funny, or it can be harsh, or with somebody you can't trust, or it can be a predatory threat. But even to that degree, right there in the agitprop detour, that turns out to not really be a detour, but to consume the story of the film, the one about Honey's niece and her abusive boyfriend. The movie even seems to start to frame a kind of implied horror to sex, or at least sexual attraction, as being a lure into mortal disaster. Or at the very least, it's mired in the emotional unavailability, the avoidant attachment style that defines Honey as this kind of pulp archetype of the hard-bit Southern or Midwestern or whatever flyover lesbian who rather keenly slots into the already prevalent archetype of the lone, hard-nosed white boy PI about as easily as Shaft did in the 1970s. Honey Don't is probably the most repressed queer movie you're going to see, which is a horrific shame given that while his brother is faffing off thinking he can rewrite Shakespeare or something, he, Ethan Cohen, actually decided to sit down with his lesbian wife and say, hey, let's make a feminist queer pulp movie. Not a lot of those. Ethan and Trisha have done everything entirely right from a motivational standpoint. The problem is that Ethan and Trisha, without getting into too much detail so as to avoid any specific judgment, this is truly not an attempt to throw stones in a glass house of my own bountiful perversities. The problem is that Ethan and Trisha are huge freaks. In particular, the relationship between Charlie Day's character, a police homicide detective named Marty, between him and Honey, with Marty constantly asking Honey out in a telegraphed, routine tradition of him making passes at her, only for Honey to keep having to remind him that she's a lesbian and that she only likes girls. There's clearly an inside humor to this background material, as has been profiled in terms of Cohen and Cook's relationship beyond the camera, even a semi-autobiographical element in this film, with Marty being a clear stand-in for Cohen himself, the guy who really did put in all his chips to marry a woman who identifies as queer and a lesbian just because he really likes her and he thinks they really get along together. But that also means that when these two individuals, Ethan and Trisha, who, God bless them, managed to make a loving and professional relationship work the way they have, not just for practical reasons, but clearly for reasons that they would understand far more intimately than anybody else, most especially me, could, and their relationship even seeming to stagger the imaginations of so many monogamous hetero industry couples, whether in front of or behind the camera, it really does say something that one of the most successful Hollywood couples, both professionally and in terms of just their romantic life, the way their relationship works, is literally a non-monogamous straight guy married to a non-monogamous lesbian. They have a remarkable relationship, not just from some personal, anomalous perspective in terms of their framing in the industry, but in terms of queer culture, in the embracing of non-monogamy and non-heteronormativity, of really breaking the boundaries of how relationships are formed and why people get married and what love actually means. And yet none of that is reflected in Honey Don't. The most interesting things about these two artists, these two filmmakers that should be inflecting the bizarre pastiche and patchwork of their own queer movie, is completely avoided and run away from and sent up as a joke. It's the flavor of a united vision of a straight male filmmaker who knows so intimately the power and, to a certain extent, really shamelessly likes the idea of catering to the pleasure of looking at beautiful women, in the way that the camera laps up Lyra Abava in the opening far more than anything else, and progressively less of anything as the film goes on. But this is also a film by a lesbian woman who co-wrote the story, edited the film, and not only seems to have at least a similarly intuitive attraction to this shameless sensuality, but through the characters she and Cohen have crafted, drawing from the pages of pulp literature, remolding archetypes, reinforces its own archetype of the basically emotionally unattached, non-monogamous, emotionally avoidant lesbian. The collision of these two impulses seems to be so harmonious in its collaboration that it can't come off as much more than the most neurotic thing this side of a David Cronenberg joint. It's appropriate that in the closest you're going to get to a real spoiler here, the film is bookended by this luxurious lapping up of Lyra Abava, and then the promise that before the credits roll, Honey actually manages to get her to bed too. The wild world of sapphic wonders is just around the corner. But you never actually get there with Honey Don't. And the question is, why not? Why is the only representation of straight sex cosmically satiric, whereas the only representation of lesbian sex is casual and murky, and again, eventually borders on danger and disaster? You should never chalk up to deep psychology what you can chalk up to incompetence, but Honey Don't really seems to take the don't part about as seriously as the honey. This movie is a honey pot for sad wretches like this Ichabod Crane-looking bozo to my right here, but it's a long montage of don'ts. Don't get too comfortable with anything nice to look at. Don't expect any of the pithy dialogue to really bite. Don't expect any of the jokes to land. And don't expect Cohen to do anything else but just keep recycling material through the veil of his wife's own creative duplicity. The homage to Abava's form is shocking in its sensuality, and is exactly what we need more of in an adult-oriented film culture. Everything else is just a cobbled-together stash of liberal progressive agitprop that is itself basically rendered a conservative dryout because it's so behind the far more boundary-pushing and binary-bending trails being set by fresher queer filmmakers, with the final twist of this movie's screw being that its own kitschy throwback gratuity seems to be a vehicle for avoiding authentically representing a side of queer and non-traditional relationships and identities that Cohen and Cook already represent themselves in their private lives in a way that is far more interesting and challenging than just a promise that one horny, emotionally unavailable lesbian will get to have an actually good sex scene once the screen already crashes to black. The only don't that should have been put up as bold as it is on that poster, and hopefully lit up in natural neon and not just an illustration, should have been the one put in front of Cohen and Cook's faces before they wrote this dreck. Look, it's the thought that counts. Except in movies, where thoughts are fractions of pennies and my time is good money, and nobody needed an ultra-violent lesbian crime black comedy where the violence feels routine and phony even at its most schematically grotesque, where only the first few minutes are sexy, where the crimes are all dumb, and where nothing really funny ever happens. I'm giving Honey Don't a charitable 2.5 out of 5.
Wow. Jesus, that wasn't as much of a rant as it was like a slow euthanasia.
Did anybody ask you anything? Did anybody ask you a goddamned thing, Dad? Shut the f*** up!
And with that, I'm tapping out of here. Thank you all so much for sticking through this whole video. F*** the comments, unless they're about how much you love me. Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is GURRDIE the Daemonosaur. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie Rant. I'm gonna catch you guys next time. F***ing off for interrupting me, you